Black women, how often do you experience racism in the country you live in? I've heard that racism is actually worse in non-Western countries than it is in the US and Europe. In the southern United States, I'd say intermittently, and it depends on what an individual qualifies as racism. Like I see flags, monuments, news headlines, t-shirts, etc. very often, at least once a week, that are considered to be racially charged and anti-black. But direct racism or hate crimes is very rare in my experience. Yeah, the South is really weird. Currently going to a large public university in the South who wasn't born and raised in the South. It's almost like the typical white hetero Southern-born college student is trying to be very progressive, but it's hard to reconcile that and Southern pride, particularly involving history. It's much more common to have the one crazy uncle that has 10 Confederate flag bumper sticks. It was a real culture shock for me since I grew up in the urban Northeast. I grew up in the Northeast and it was microaggressions on the daily in the metropolitan city I lived in. Things like calling a majority black neighborhood sketchy, despite it being middle-class homes. People loved to praise the city for its diversity, but the city was very segregated and full of systematic racism when looking at different types of data. Urban cities get masked for its liberal ideals and diversity, but there's a racist underbelly. I'm not praising the urban Northeast at all, although I acknowledge that it was implied heavily in my comment. The South's discrimination is much more overt, in my experience, and you're incredibly right about the urban Northeast having prevalent covert racism. I was just not mentally prepared for the crazy deep state, Confederate Southerners. Hell, just yesterday, Lindsey Graham from SC, if you're a young, African American or an immigrant, you can go anywhere in this state, you just need to be conservative, not liberal. Like WTF. Right. I don't think anyone can be mentally prepared for that of any race. Racists are both unfortunately and fortunately cowards. Makes sense. Yeah. Like Sasquatch. I'm a NBPOC, so I'm not going to answer the question. I just was a little unsettled by it and wanted to offer up a thought. I think that this question might be confusing because of the difference between institutionalized racism and interpersonal racism. This phrasing sort of naturally suggests interpersonal racism, or things like hate crimes. However, most types of racism that are being protested in the US now are institutionalized police shootings, mass incarceration, segregated schooling, etc. I think that the difficult things about these is that one person's experience doesn't count as racism. These are almost racism by big data, and the actual racism is only seen when you aggregate outcomes across the population. Thus, in one sense, people experience racism every day because racism imperceptibly creeps into the institutions people interact with. Again, I think the phrasing of the question won't make people think about that case just as much. That's a really interesting and important distinction, especially because people try to act like the only kind of racism is when someone uses racial slurs against someone, and defend institutionalized racism as that's just how things work. Thanks for pointing that out. Growing up in Sweden, not much to be honest. It was mostly when I was younger, but kids are cruel. I suppose it was worse in the 70s when my dad moved here, there weren't a lot of immigrants here back then. Then again, I'm light skin, I'm sure it's worse for dark skinned people. It was mostly just curiosity mixed in with a bit of prejudice. People touching my hair, asking where I come from and if I can change my skin color. It just gets really annoying sometimes. I find myself getting dirty looks from time to time, but I don't really make much of it. They think it's really weird when I walk around with my white relatives. Asking if you can change your skin color. I'm hoping it was a young child that asked you that, because that's such a weird question coming from a middle schooler or older. Germany do be kinda racist still. I feel like the 2015 refugee crisis made it a lot worse. Suddenly everyone with a different skin color was presumed a refugee who takes away our jobs, even though they might just be a black German, or immigrated in a totally different way. True. Even my white mother is kinda racist and she gave birth to me, like what? You have a black child. How can you be racist? It's a UK problem too, thankfully getting better though. Bullshit newspapers like The Sun and The Daily were some real aggravators there. Oh yes. It's more subtle racism from what I've noticed, but I've been called the N-word a few times from catcallers I've ignored. Same. Elementary school was hell. Such a shame. I've noticed in many posts about racism in Europe German subreddits many don't seem to acknowledge or admit there is racism and or white privilege here. While the US can be messy, at least it's acknowledged that racism is an issue compared to turning a blind eye to it. It's been a long while since I've been back. When I was in elementary school, small, farming town in North Germany, it was very subtle racism, except for the one man who was pissed drunk off his mind at Schützenfest, and decided to ask a 9-year-old black girl if she hadn't washed her face, skin. For context, I was the darkest person in my town, despite being very light, similar complexion to Zoe Kravitz. In the winter time, haha. My best friend, still to this day, and I went to Lidl once, and she asked me if we wanted to buy N-word K, and I looked at her blankly, after which she apologized. I was never mad at her, because she truly is a good friend and not racist, but it just goes to show how ingrained taught some things are. I also once found an old Kinderliederbuch from my aunt Sorkusen's youth, which had a song about 10 little African children climbing up a ladder and falling down, so there's that. The accompanying visuals were what you were probably imagining. In retrospect, I feel pretty badass being able to say that 9-year-old me ripped that page out and tucked the book back into the shelf. Can confirm. I also live in North Germany, and little children are most likely more open about the racism but don't realize how bad it is, and older children will mostly exclude you from the group and avoid you. In the US it is intermittent. I've been directly called the N-word only like 5 times in my life. It has usually been little snide comments like, "You look good for a black girl," "Do you know your dad?" "You talk white," etc. I hear comments like this almost weekly. I've traveled all around the world, and I wouldn't say it's worse in non-Western countries, or at least I haven't experienced any blatant or subtle racism, not even in China, which I was surprised about. I've been on every continent except Antarctica and have never had an issue. I'm a dark-skinned black woman with natural hair, and everywhere I've been the people have been very kind and welcoming. OMG. I'm so sorry for those comments. Holy shit. How does one talk white or black eye? I'm not sure about people. That's actually the line I hear the most. People assume that talking properly and correctly are white traits, and that talking incorrectly or ghetto are black traits. That's so dumb though. Like, people can talk ghetto or use slang, but that's not something based on race. I'm not sure about humans anymore. I've heard relatives say, "Oh wow, I didn't know he was black, he sounded white" person over the phone, and like, what's sounding white? I assume it means they sound educated, but I just don't understand how someone can talk white or black. IG, there are voice stereotypes or something. Once someone thought I was a POC over Discord because my voice is deep for a girl. Like, what am I supposed to sound like? I used to have a BFF who was black, and she had a way higher voice than me. Some of the Chinese people in my country are horrible. I worked for a Chinese firm, and the way they treated us compared to their own people was terrible. One of my boss punished a laborer, told him to stay under the sun cause he came late, but meanwhile the Chinese people there missed work constantly and nothing was ever done to reprimand them. Only the black workers were asked to work on Saturdays and sometimes Sunday without any overtime. It was really horrible. Is this Africa? Yeah, it is. Nigeria. When I read this I immediately thought, Nigeria. My mum keeps saying the Chinese are slowly colonizing the country and people are just letting it happen. I live in a pretty progressive and diverse area, so the racism I deal with more often is the microaggressive kind. Like backhanded compliments, "You look pretty for a black girl," getting called an Oreo, people marveling at how well spoken I am. Growing up it was difficult because although my town is diverse, I went to a majority white school, so I got made fun of for my black features, big lips, big butt, and big nose. I have been called the N-word only a couple of times. But what's astonishing to me is that I live near a major city and it feels like the segregation is so unspoken but very real. The city's black population is fairly high, but the people who work downtown are majority white. It feels like the only time you see black people or NBPOC working is when they're serving lunch to white people. It's so hard for POC to get corporate jobs in this city. Also, the city is becoming so gentrified. Neighborhoods that were stereotypically labeled as sketchy, another microaggression, are getting more and more white because it's cheaper to live in those neighborhoods. I have a white friend who mentioned a neighborhood they were looking to live in, and I had to do a double take because that neighborhood was notoriously labeled as sketchy for years. It makes me sad to see what's happening there, honestly. So many black folks are being displaced and subtly forced out of their spaces. As far as other countries, I studied abroad in Spain and I actually didn't deal with much racism, surprisingly enough. I only dealt with racism from my own American classmates and not the Spaniards. Where I experienced racism was in Morocco. But it was the ignorant kind. There were like 8 of us and we had lunch with a Moroccan student and her family, and there was so much going on and I was really quiet, because I'm an introvert and have anxiety, and the Moroccan student called me out and said, "Why aren't you talking more? Usually your people talk a lot and are louder. Suffice to say I didn't end up talking at all. And then we went to the city to look and shop around, and I stopped somewhere to look at a scarf, and the salesman came up to me and started speaking in a horrendous Jamaican accent. He just saw the color of my skin, assumed a lot about my background, and started berating me in a sad attempt to colloquialize. That's why I say it was more ignorant in Morocco. And by the way, my white American friend who claimed to be an ally laughed at me both times. Also, suffice to say, we are not friends anymore, lol. This was something that really struck me as I was visiting the US from Canada, where there are generally far fewer black people. Here, in my large Canadian city, most servers just look young, like they're working part-time to pay for uni. You don't often see a racial divide unless you're specifically at a restaurant serving a particular culture's cuisine. However, when I visited various mid-sized to large cities in the States, I truly did notice that there was a much higher percentage of people doing customer service or cleaning type work who were either black or brown. The people I was traveling with also noticed and commented on it. It surprised us, I think, that the differences were so stark. I'm in the US, and pretty often. I live in a progressive area, DC, and while it's miles better than where I grew up deep south, people are not nearly as progressive as they like to think they are. If I don't wear my wedding engagement rings and am with my kids alone, visibly pregnant alone, I sometimes get comments about my baby daddy. People often assume I grew up poor and very disadvantaged, which isn't true, solidly middle class here. When I mention that I grew up in a single-parent household from 13 on, people assume my dad abandoned us when again. Not the case, he died. Being in an interracial relationship, I hear it all. People assume I'm the nanny. People never assume my husband and I are together. People often assume I am the help regardless of what I'm wearing. Going in for a job interview, interviews sometimes would look crestfallen when they'd realize it was me they were interviewing and not the white woman they were expecting. It's just little things like that, rarely anything outright like being called the N-word, although that has happened, but not where I live now. It's all very draining. Appalled this is supposed to be the progressive part of your experience, yikes. I'm so sorry you have to deal with all that. It sounds fully infuriating. I've lived in both the southern part of the US and the West Coast, Southern California, and both have been interesting. I think in the South people were more proudly ignorant and racist and closed-minded, and they called it Southern pride. Like bragging about an uncle who fought in the Civil War for the South, and waving the Confederate flag, etc. Then in Southern California they are ignorant too, but they don't like to believe it. They separate themselves from Southerners and swear they are not racist. But they are in a different way, more microaggressive than overt. Also, the West Coast has more racial division than the South in me. So urban has lots of Middle Easterners, LA has more black and Latino people, other areas are pretty much strictly Asian, and San Juan Capistrano has more rich white and rich Latinos, etc. etc. I feel Trump makes it okay to be racist. The non-white live at risk every day. In the UK, a lot more than people think and are willing to admit. I live in Canada. The racism is passive-aggressive. They wouldn't outright say something blatant like using slurs, but microaggressions. The examples are people asking what my background is despite telling them I'm Canadian-born and trying to make me feel less Canadian for not being white, people assuming that I'm renting a place instead of being a homeowner, and the one I love the most is when I'm on the job people asking me if I'm the nursing assistant when I'm actually the charge nurse. What would irritate me is when I get told I don't act like a typical black person, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, or having people assume that I'm mixed race because they see me as attractive and only think the most attractive black women have to be mixed, which I take deep offense to. No disrespect to anyone mixed race. Canadians like to pride themselves as being tolerant of different races and cultures and like talking down about Americans, but honestly, as someone who's always in the USA regularly for work, I find Canadians no different than Americans, and I seriously get annoyed when Canadians point out issues in America when we have our own issues. Black men are more likely to be profiled in Toronto than in Los Angeles. I can speak from experience. I've been profiled when I lived in Toronto despite being a woman. I travel a lot, and with the exception of France and the UK, I find Europe a lot more racist than in Canada and the USA hands down, and I wouldn't feel comfortable living there. Just my 2 cents. Pretty often, but it's less overt in person. Like microaggressions, casual stuff, coded language, colorism. A lot of people make messed up comments about our hair no matter what we do with it. I do get the whole, "you're not like other girls" thing from guys for not being stereotypical like they're expecting, or they say they like that my skin isn't too dark or too light. Where I live it's generally progressive. The only racism I experience are very subtle, benevolent forms like dating preferences. So I can't quite complain. I live in the southwestern US, and in a very POC-dominant state, so it really varies. I've been subject to various microaggressions, and it's not uncommon to see hats, signs, or painted windows. I've also dealt with a fair amount of colorism and had slurs thrown at me. Hate crimes and the like are not something I've experienced firsthand, though. Sometimes. And it's more microaggressive since I live in a city in the United States. I also don't stick around people I identify as racist, so I keep my distance pretty quick or am planning my exit because I find those type of people really aggravating. So I'm fine because I know where to focus my energy. All the time. I live in the US and it's a super racist country. It happens, but it's relatively rare for me personally. I did have a boss who was colorist and I knew a few women who have experienced it, like maybe once, but I don't think it's as bad as in the US. Our cops are shitty in other ways but not racist. All the time. I'm born and raised Southern, still here only one state away from home. I've never experienced any direct racism in my life. No one has walked up to me and called me AN, but there's so many microaggressions and other subtle ways that makes me uncomfortable. Edit. I'm on the east coast of the US. I live in the US, it doesn't happen a lot but often to me. I get told, I'm light for a black girl, or, I talk white or too white. I've been called an Oreo. And I've been called a stupid N-word by a college roommate. I got told by another student at my college I look more aggressive because I'm black. Also in elementary school I was maybe 1 out of the 10 black kids at the school and there was a ton of racism. The insults and bullying were never ending about my skin and hair. I was outed as the weird girl because I was different, aka black, and had curly, nappy hair. None. I live in East Africa, barely any racism cause we all lack, and the country I live in is extremely peaceful compared to the US. Even though we aren't very well off, there's absolutely no discrimination of races. Nearly every day, parents shush their kids every time they point out that I'm black. We have job offers only for white people here. Recently wasn't hired because I was black and the parents of the kids wanted a white teacher. People moving away from me when they can if they see I'm black. People taking pictures of me without my permission. People spitting the moment they see me coming down the street. I'm kind of used to it now. Assuming you're in Asia. Yep. In the big C. Hello. If you have made it to the end of the video, make sure to click the subscribe button below. You can also check some of my previous videos. Wait, just wait, comment and like too. I am Pink Balloon and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.